Night settles gently over Harlem, the way it always has, like a heavy curtain being drawn across the streets. The glow of streetlights pools on cracked sidewalks, reflecting off parked cars and storefront windows that have seen too much to bother remembering faces. Somewhere in the distance, a siren cries and then fades, becoming part of the city's lullaby. This is the hour when stories breathe. Not the loud ones told in daylight, but the quiet truths whispered after midnight, when the city exhales and the past feels close enough to touch. In these hours, certain names still drift through memory like smoke. Names that were never printed in bold headlines, never celebrated or officially recorded, yet carried weight in places where reputation meant survival. One of those names is Azie Faison Jr. Not shouted, not bragged about, spoken softly, with a pause before and after, as if the speaker is deciding how much to say and how much to keep to themselves. Because in Harlem, especially during the late 1980s and early 1990s, survival often depended on knowing when to stay quiet. Azie Faison's story does not begin with flashing lights or dramatic gunfire. It begins with streets that were already tired long before he ever stepped into them. Harlem was a place of deep history and deeper contradictions, culture and struggle sharing the same block, ambition walking hand in hand with danger. By the time the crack era took hold, the neighborhood had become an open market of opportunity and loss, where money moved fast and lives disappeared faster. Many young men entered that world believing they could control it, believing intelligence or fearlessness would keep them safe. Very few were right. What makes Azie Faison different is not that he played the game. Many did. What makes him different is that he lived long enough to tell his story, and lived long enough to walk away. In a time when funerals were more common than retirements, his survival stands out like a quiet anomaly. It invites a question that lingers in the mind, especially late at night: how did one hustler outlast an era designed to destroy him? To understand that question, you have to slow down and listen to the city the way it once sounded. You have to imagine Harlem before the internet, before surveillance cameras on every corner, when information traveled by word of mouth and trust was currency. Men learned quickly who talked too much, who moved too loudly, who let ego guide their decisions. The streets watched everything, and they remembered mistakes far longer than successes. Azie Faison moved through this world without the hunger for attention that swallowed so many others. While others chased status, he chased understanding. While others announced themselves, he observed. In Harlem, observation could mean the difference between making it home at night and becoming another name murmured in past tense. This was a place where ambition had to be balanced with restraint, and where patience often paid better than aggression. The year 1991 sits like a marker in this story, not because it was unique, but because it was unforgiving. Law enforcement pressure tightened, rivalries intensified, and paranoia crept into every interaction. The streets no longer felt expansive, they felt crowded, watched, boxed in. Deals that once seemed routine carried new risks. Familiar faces disappeared, some into prison cells, others into unmarked graves. The game was changing, and many players didn't realize it until it was too late. Yet even as the walls closed in, Azie Faison remained a step removed, as if he understood something others did not. He did not mistake momentum for permanence. He did not confuse money with safety. And perhaps most importantly, he did not fall in love with the image of himself as untouchable. In an environment where mythology could be fatal, this humility was a form of armor. There is a tendency, especially in stories about crime, to rush toward the extremes, the rise, the fall, the violence, the spectacle. But Azie's story asks for a different pace. It asks to be told slowly, like a memory revisited at night, where details matter and silence speaks as loudly as action. This is not a story about domination or conquest. It is a story about navigation. About reading a dangerous landscape and knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to leave entirely. As Harlem slept, deals were made quietly in apartments with drawn curtains. Cash was counted in low light. Conversations were measured, each word weighed before being released. Trust was rare, and loyalty was tested daily. In this world, survival was not heroic. It was methodical. And those who survived rarely celebrated it out loud. The fascination with Azie Faison does not come from exaggerated legends, but from the absence of tragedy that usually concludes stories like his. He did not die young. He was not paraded through the courts in handcuffs as a cautionary tale. Instead, he stepped away, carrying the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had learned. That quiet exit is what makes people lean in closer when his name is mentioned. Because leaving the game alive was, in many ways, the greatest hustle of all. This story unfolds not to glorify the past, but to understand it. To understand how a specific moment in Harlem's history shaped the lives within it, and how one man managed to pass through that moment without being consumed. As the night deepens and the city grows quieter, this story becomes something else entirely, a reflection on choices, timing, and the fragile line between survival and disappearance. And as we begin, it's worth remembering that every legend is built from ordinary nights just like this one. Nights where nothing explodes, nothing announces itself, but everything changes slowly, almost invisibly. Somewhere between the hum of traffic and the echo of distant voices, the path of Azie Faison Jr. began to take shape. What happened next would place him in the shadows of Harlem history, not as a cautionary ghost, but as a rare survivor of a game that rarely forgives. Before money ever entered the picture, before reputation carried weight and names traveled quietly from block to block, there was simply a boy growing up in Harlem, shaped by forces far larger than himself. The streets did not announce what they would one day demand from him. They revealed themselves slowly, in fragments, through sound, routine, and observation. Morning light crept through apartment windows, bouncing off brick walls and fire escapes, while the city stirred awake with the low rumble of buses and the distant rhythm of conversations rising from the sidewalks below. Azie Faison Jr. was born into a neighborhood that had already lived many lives. Harlem had known glory, decline, pride, and neglect, all layered on top of one another like old posters peeling from the walls. By the time he was old enough to notice the world around him, the optimism of earlier decades had faded, replaced by a daily struggle that felt normal to those who lived it. Families worked hard, stretched paychecks thin, and learned to endure. Children learned early how to read a room, how to sense tension, how to recognize when it was time to stay inside and when it was safe to wander. Home was not a place of luxury, but it was a place of grounding. The routines of family life, meals, arguments, laughter, and long silences, formed a quiet backdrop to his upbringing. Like many children in Harlem during that era, Azie grew up surrounded by adults who carried exhaustion in their posture and resilience in their voices. They spoke about bills, about work that never seemed to pay enough, about a system that felt distant and unmoved by their efforts. These conversations seeped into him, not as bitterness, but as awareness. School offered structure, but it also highlighted the limits placed on children from neighborhoods like his. Classrooms were crowded, resources thin, and expectations often low. Teachers came and went, some committed, others overwhelmed. Education was presented as a path forward, yet outside the school walls, the reality looked different. He could see with his own eyes that the people with the nicest clothes, the newest cars, and the most visible freedom did not always follow the rules laid out in textbooks. The streets filled in the gaps left by formal education. From stoops and sidewalks, Azie observed the men who seemed to move with purpose. They weren't clocking in or out of visible jobs, yet they always had money. They carried themselves differently, calm, alert, respected, sometimes feared. No one needed to explain what they did. The lessons were implicit. Power, in this environment, was not announced, it was recognized. Still, his childhood was not defined solely by temptation or hardship. There were moments of simplicity, playing outside until the streetlights came on, laughter echoing between buildings, the small victories of adolescence that felt huge at the time. Music drifted from windows, blending soul, funk, and the early sounds of hip-hop. Harlem breathed culture even in its struggles, and that sense of identity left an imprint that would stay with him long after the neighborhood itself began to change. As he grew older, the contrast between possibility and limitation became harder to ignore. Opportunities felt theoretical, while survival felt immediate. He watched adults around him navigate compromises, saw how easily one bad decision could ripple through an entire family. These observations did not push him toward rebellion right away. Instead, they made him thoughtful, cautious, and attentive. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to absorb information without revealing his own intentions. By his teenage years, the environment had begun to shift. The drug trade, once more discreet, was becoming more visible. Corners changed hands, new faces appeared, and the energy on the streets grew sharper, more volatile. There was money to be made, but it came wrapped in risk. Violence was no longer an abstract concept discussed in hushed tones, it was something people could point to, name, mourn. Azie saw peers drawn in quickly, intoxicated by fast cash and the promise of status. Some returned home with pockets full and confidence inflated. Others didn't return at all. These outcomes existed side by side, and the randomness of it all was unsettling. There was no clear formula for success or safety. The streets rewarded intelligence one day and punished it the next. What set Azie apart even then was his patience. He did not rush to prove himself. He watched how quickly attention attracted problems. He noticed which men lasted longer and which ones burned out fast. He began to understand that the loudest voices often carried the shortest lifespans. This understanding formed quietly, without mentors or lectures. It was learned through observation and the slow accumulation of lived examples. Family expectations still hovered in the background. There was an unspoken hope that he would find stability through conventional means, that he would avoid the traps that had claimed so many others. But hope alone could not compete with the daily evidence of inequality. Jobs were scarce, and advancement seemed reserved for people who lived elsewhere. The gap between effort and reward felt discouragingly wide. As the years passed, Harlem continued to press in on him, shaping his worldview. He learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, the times when certain blocks were busy, when others went quiet, when tension hung heavy in the air. These patterns became second nature. They taught him that the city spoke constantly, if you knew how to listen. By the time Azie stood on the edge of adulthood, he carried with him a deep understanding of his surroundings and a clear-eyed view of his options. None of them were easy. Each came with consequences, visible or hidden. The streets had not claimed him yet, but they had introduced themselves fully, offering both temptation and warning in equal measure. This was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. Not greed, not recklessness, but awareness. A childhood shaped by observation rather than impulse. A young man standing at the threshold of choices that would define his future, aware that once he stepped forward, there would be no clean way back. The boy from Harlem had not yet become a hustler, but the city had already begun teaching him the lessons that would one day help him survive it. Harlem did not teach its lessons in classrooms or with written rules. It taught through repetition, through watching the same scenes play out on different corners, under different streetlights, with different faces. By the time Azie Faison reached his late teens, the neighborhood itself had become a kind of open-air classroom, one that never closed and never forgave inattention. Every walk down the block carried information. Every conversation overheard from a stoop or a bodega doorway added another line to an unwritten textbook. The street spoke in codes that outsiders rarely understood. A glance held longer than necessary could mean curiosity or challenge. A nod could signal respect, acknowledgement, or warning. People learned to read these signals instinctively, because misunderstanding them carried consequences. Azie absorbed this language quietly. He did not rush to participate. He watched how men positioned themselves, how they avoided certain intersections at certain hours, how they spoke carefully when strangers were nearby. The older hustlers were never formal teachers, yet they were constantly giving lessons. They showed, without explaining, how money moved from hand to hand without ceremony. They demonstrated the importance of punctuality, discretion, and consistency. One late delivery, one careless word, could unravel months of work. Azie noticed that the most successful figures rarely displayed their success openly. Their clothes were clean but not loud, their jewelry minimal, their movements deliberate. Flash invited attention, and attention attracted problems. Harlem in those years operated on layers. On the surface, daily life went on as usual, children walking to school, elders sitting on benches, shop owners opening metal gates each morning. Beneath that surface, another economy pulsed steadily. Drugs, cash, and favors circulated through invisible channels, intersecting occasionally with ordinary life but mostly staying hidden in plain sight. This dual existence fascinated Azie, not for its glamour, but for its efficiency. He began to understand that the street economy functioned on structure, not chaos. Roles were defined, territories respected, and violations punished swiftly. This was not randomness, it was order of a different kind. People often described the streets as lawless, but Azie saw that they had their own laws, enforced without paperwork or appeals. Survival depended on respecting those rules, even when they conflicted with conventional morality. The crack era intensified everything. Money flowed faster, but so did violence and betrayal. Corners that once supported one operation suddenly hosted three, each competing for the same customers. Police presence increased, informants appeared where friends once stood, and paranoia settled in like a permanent fog. For those paying attention, it was clear that the environment was growing more dangerous by the month. Azie's education continued through watching who adapted and who didn't. Some hustlers responded to pressure by becoming more aggressive, louder, more visible. Their confidence grew as their caution shrank. Others pulled back, adjusted their methods, or disappeared altogether. The streets rewarded flexibility more than bravado, and Azie took note of that distinction. There were moments when opportunity presented itself directly. A conversation here, a suggestion there. Someone noticing his quiet reliability, his ability to keep information to himself. These were not grand invitations, but subtle openings. Azie did not rush through them. He understood that once he stepped fully into that world, observation would no longer be enough. Participation carried a different kind of risk. In between these lessons, life continued. Days blended into nights, seasons changed, and Harlem remained restless. Music evolved, fashion shifted, and new slang replaced the old. Yet the underlying pressures stayed the same. Poverty lingered, opportunity remained uneven, and the streets continued to offer an alternative path, one that was visible, immediate, and dangerous. What distinguished Azie during this period was his ability to treat the streets like a study rather than a stage. He did not romanticize what he saw. He noticed the exhaustion behind the bravado, the tension behind the smiles. He saw how even the most feared men slept lightly, always alert, always expecting a knock at the door. This awareness stripped the lifestyle of illusion. He also learned the importance of timing. Harlem moved in cycles, busy hours, quiet stretches, sudden surges of activity. Understanding these rhythms could mean safety or exposure. Azie memorized them, internalized them, letting them guide his movements. He learned when to be visible and when to disappear, when to speak and when silence was safer. Trust became another subject of study. Alliances formed quickly and dissolved just as fast. Loyalty was often situational, dependent on profit rather than principle. Azie noticed that the men who survived longest trusted very few people, and even then, never completely. Information was shared sparingly, and personal details were guarded carefully. The less people knew about you, the safer you were. By absorbing these lessons, Azie was preparing himself without fully realizing it. He was building a mental framework that would later guide every decision he made. The streets were shaping him, sharpening his instincts, teaching him to think several steps ahead. This education was relentless, but it was also effective. As his understanding deepened, so did his awareness of the cost. He saw the toll the lifestyle took on families, on relationships, on peace of mind. He saw mothers grieving sons who had believed themselves untouchable. He saw friends drift apart, divided by suspicion and ambition. These images stayed with him, tempering any excitement the money might promise. Harlem, in this sense, was both teacher and warning. It offered knowledge freely, but demanded payment later. Azie stood at the edge of this realization, fully aware that the lessons he had learned would soon require application. Observation alone would no longer be enough. The classroom was closing, and the test was approaching. By the end of this period, Azie Faison had absorbed Harlem's curriculum thoroughly. He understood its language, its economy, and its dangers. He had learned that survival was less about strength and more about perception. Less about fearlessness and more about restraint. These lessons, learned quietly and patiently, would become the foundation of everything that followed, guiding him as he stepped from observation into action, from student to participant in a game that rarely allowed second chances. The first hustle did not arrive with drama or ceremony. It slipped into Azie Faison's life quietly, almost politely, as if testing whether he was ready. By the time it happened, the streets no longer felt mysterious to him. He understood their rhythms, their expectations, and their dangers. What he had not yet experienced was the weight that came with participation, the subtle shift that occurs when observation turns into involvement, when the streets stop being something you watch and becomes something that watches you back. It began with small tasks, the kind designed to measure reliability rather than ambition. Being present at the right time. Carrying something from one place to another without asking questions. Passing information accurately and without embellishment. These were not glamorous assignments, but they were important. In Harlem, trust was never given all at once. It was earned slowly, through consistency and silence. Azie approached these early steps with the same patience he had shown as an observer. He did not rush, did not boast, did not seek recognition. He treated every task as temporary, aware that any misstep could close doors permanently. This mindset allowed him to blend in, to become useful without becoming visible. The streets rewarded that balance. As he moved through these early hustles, he learned how thin the margin for error truly was. One missed meeting, one careless word, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. Harlem had long memories, and mistakes traveled faster than successes. Azie paid attention to this reality, choosing caution over speed, precision over bravado. Money, when it came, arrived quietly. Not in piles, not in displays, but in steady increments that felt almost unreal at first. Compared to the struggle he had grown up with, even small amounts felt significant. Yet he resisted the urge to celebrate. He had seen too many people announce their success only to invite scrutiny, envy, and danger. Instead, he let the money pass through his hands without changing his outward appearance or routine. With each successful task, expectations grew slightly. Responsibilities expanded. The people around him began to rely on his consistency. This reliance came with its own pressure. Dependability in the street economy was both a compliment and a risk. The more useful you became, the harder it was to step away unnoticed. Azie was aware of this, even as he continued forward. The first true test came when something went wrong, not dramatically, but enough to reveal how quickly situations could turn. A delivery was delayed. A location changed unexpectedly. For a moment, uncertainty hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Azie responded not with panic, but with calm. He waited, listened, adjusted. When the situation resolved without escalation, it left an impression. In a world where chaos was common, composure stood out. Through these experiences, Azie learned that hustling was less about aggression and more about logistics. It required planning, adaptability, and emotional control. Anger created mistakes. Fear created hesitation. The most successful hustlers learned to operate in a narrow emotional range, staying focused and detached even when stakes were high. He also learned the importance of boundaries. Not every opportunity needed to be taken. Not every invitation needed to be accepted. Some deals carried more risk than reward, and recognizing those distinctions was critical. Azie observed how others fell into traps by chasing quick profits without considering long-term consequences. He chose a different approach, even when it meant walking away from immediate gain. As his involvement deepened, the streets began to respond differently to him. People who once overlooked him now acknowledged his presence. Conversations paused when he approached, then resumed once he had passed. This subtle shift signaled acceptance, but it also marked the end of anonymity. Azie felt this change keenly. Being seen meant being remembered. Despite this, he maintained a low profile. He avoided unnecessary conflict, spoke little, and listened often. He understood that reputation was built not on stories told about you, but on the absence of stories. If no one had reason to talk, you were doing something right. The psychological toll of hustling revealed itself gradually. Even small tasks carried an undercurrent of tension. Sleep became lighter, senses sharper. He found himself replaying interactions in his mind, analyzing tone, timing, and intent. This vigilance was exhausting, but it was also protective. In Harlem, relaxation could be mistaken for vulnerability. Azie balanced this new reality carefully. He did not allow the hustle to consume his identity. Outside of his street responsibilities, he maintained a sense of normalcy, blending into everyday life. This separation helped him stay grounded, reminding him that the hustle was a means, not an end. The first hustle taught him something crucial: survival depended on restraint. Every instinct pushed him to prove himself, to move faster, to earn more. But experience whispered a different lesson. Slow growth was safer. Modesty was protection. And silence, above all else, was power. By the time he completed his earliest hustles, Azie Faison was no longer simply a student of the streets. He had become a participant, tested and accepted, though still on the margins. He understood that the path ahead was narrowing, choices becoming fewer and more consequential. Each step forward reduced the possibility of stepping back. Yet for now, he remained steady, moving carefully through a world that punished carelessness and rewarded patience. The first hustle had not transformed him overnight. Instead, it had sharpened what was already there: awareness, discipline, and a quiet determination to survive. These qualities would carry him deeper into the game, even as they planted the seeds of an eventual exit that few would ever manage to make. As the months passed, the way money entered Azie Faison's life began to change, not in volume at first, but in rhythm. It no longer arrived as something unexpected or fleeting. It became predictable, almost routine, and that predictability brought with it a new kind of danger. In Harlem, when money starts moving quietly, it means systems are forming. And systems, once established, demand discipline to survive. Azie understood early that money was not the goal, it was a tool. Too many people treated cash as proof of success, letting it reshape their behavior, their posture, their priorities. He had watched this happen countless times. Someone would get a little ahead, and suddenly their walk changed, their voice grew louder, their presence more noticeable. That visibility rarely lasted long before drawing the wrong kind of attention. So he made a conscious decision to let money change his life as little as possible on the surface. He did not upgrade his wardrobe dramatically. He did not announce purchases or flaunt spending. His routine remained steady, almost unremarkable. This consistency acted as camouflage, allowing him to move through the neighborhood without signaling that his circumstances had shifted. Behind the scenes, however, he was meticulous. Cash was counted carefully, stored cautiously, and moved deliberately. Every dollar had a purpose. He avoided impulsive decisions, understanding that discipline was what separated short-term players from those who lasted. Harlem rewarded those who treated hustling like a business rather than a performance. As his operations grew, so did the complexity of managing them. Supply chains, timing, and locations all required constant attention. Azie learned that success depended not on bold moves, but on smooth execution. When everything ran quietly, it meant fewer questions, fewer eyes, and fewer problems. Silence, once again, proved to be his greatest ally. He also became more selective about the people he worked with. Early on, enthusiasm was easy to find, but reliability was rare. Azie paid close attention to how people handled small responsibilities before trusting them with larger ones. He noticed who complained, who panicked, and who stayed calm under pressure. These observations informed his decisions, shaping a circle built on dependability rather than charisma. The streets around him continued to grow louder, even as he stayed quiet. Competition intensified, and some hustlers responded by escalating, bigger moves, flashier displays, riskier tactics. Azie watched these developments with caution. He understood that escalation often led to exposure, and exposure led to consequences. He chose steadiness instead. Money also changed how others perceived him. Without saying a word, people began to assume competence and capability. Requests came more frequently, some reasonable, others dangerous. Saying no became a necessary skill. In Harlem, refusal could be interpreted as disrespect or weakness if handled poorly. Azie learned to decline opportunities without creating friction, using timing and tone to keep relationships intact. The psychological relationship with money evolved as well. What once felt like relief now carried weight. Each dollar represented not just profit, but responsibility. It tied him more tightly to the world he was navigating, making exit increasingly complicated. Azie remained aware of this tension, reminding himself that accumulation without foresight could become a trap. He also recognized that money attracted not just opportunity, but envy. Even without overt displays, success had a way of revealing itself. Whispers traveled. People speculated. Some admired quietly, others resented silently. Azie did not underestimate the power of resentment. He understood that threats did not always come from rivals, sometimes they came from those who felt left behind. To counter this, he maintained humility in his interactions. He did not assert dominance unnecessarily or belittle others' struggles. He treated people with a level of respect that diffused potential hostility. This approach did not guarantee safety, but it reduced friction, buying him time and space to operate. As the scale of his hustling increased, so did the stakes. Mistakes now carried heavier consequences. A miscalculation could cost more than money, it could cost trust, freedom, or life. This awareness sharpened his focus. He double-checked decisions, planned contingencies, and remained flexible. The streets were unpredictable, and rigidity could be fatal. Despite the growing pressure, Azie found a strange calm in routine. There was comfort in structure, in knowing what needed to be done and doing it well. This calmness was not arrogance, it was discipline. It allowed him to navigate tense situations without revealing anxiety or fear. Yet beneath this controlled exterior, the weight of responsibility accumulated. Sleep came, but lightly. Even quiet nights carried an undercurrent of alertness. He learned to live with this state, understanding that vigilance was the price of participation. Money moved quietly through Azie Faison's hands, and that quiet movement became his signature. In a world obsessed with noise and recognition, his restraint set him apart. It did not make him invincible, but it made him less visible, less predictable, and therefore harder to target. By mastering the art of quiet money, Azie solidified his place in Harlem's underground economy without becoming consumed by it. He was building something stable in an unstable world, even as he understood that no structure in that environment was permanent. This balance, between engagement and distance, between profit and caution, would define his path forward, shaping the choices that lay ahead as the streets grew ever more unforgiving. As Azie Faison's footing in the streets became more secure, another reality emerged just as clearly as the money and the risk: nothing in Harlem was ever done alone. Every move, no matter how small, existed within a web of relationships, some visible, some barely spoken, some understood without words. Allies mattered. Partners mattered. And just as important were the unspoken rules that governed how those relationships survived under pressure. Trust in Harlem was never absolute. It was conditional, constantly tested by circumstance. Azie learned this early, watching alliances form quickly around opportunity and dissolve just as quickly when profits dipped or danger increased. He paid attention to how men spoke about each other when they thought no one was listening. Praise was rare and often temporary. Criticism, when it surfaced, carried warning signs. The people Azie worked with were not chosen for friendship or familiarity. They were chosen for reliability. He valued consistency over charm, silence over bravado. Those who talked too much, even if well-intentioned, were liabilities. Information had a way of traveling farther than intended, and once it left your mouth, you no longer controlled where it landed. Partnerships developed slowly. At first, interactions were transactional and limited. Small collaborations tested boundaries and behavior. Azie watched how others reacted under stress, whether they panicked, blamed, or adapted. These moments revealed more than casual conversations ever could. Pressure stripped away performance and exposed character. In Harlem, loyalty was rarely declared outright. It was demonstrated through action. Showing up when expected. Handling problems without creating new ones. Protecting information even when there was personal gain to be had from sharing it. Azie measured people by these standards, not by promises or reputations. At the same time, he understood that no alliance was permanent. Circumstances changed too quickly for guarantees. Someone reliable today could become desperate tomorrow. Someone cautious could suddenly feel invincible after a string of successes. Azie never allowed himself to forget this. Even among trusted partners, he maintained a degree of separation, a private space where decisions were his alone. The unspoken rules of the streets governed every interaction. Respect was currency, but it had to be handled carefully. Too much assertion could provoke challenges. Too little could invite exploitation. Azie learned to navigate this balance by staying composed, never reactive. Disputes were addressed quietly when possible, avoiding escalation that drew attention. There were also rules about territory, timing, and discretion. Certain areas belonged to certain operations, and crossing those lines without permission carried consequences. Certain hours were safer than others. Certain conversations were never held in public, no matter how convenient it seemed. These rules were rarely written down or formally explained, yet everyone understood them. Ignoring them marked you as reckless or inexperienced. Azie's ability to observe and respect these boundaries strengthened his reputation. He was seen as someone who understood the game beyond surface-level hustle. This understanding made others more comfortable working with him, even if they never fully trusted him. In Harlem, comfort often mattered more than trust. As his circle widened slightly, Azie became more aware of the fragility of group dynamics. Jealousy lurked beneath even successful partnerships. If one person appeared to benefit more than another, resentment could grow quietly, unnoticed until it erupted. Azie managed this by keeping operations balanced and expectations clear, minimizing opportunities for envy to take root. He also recognized the danger of emotional attachment. Friendship blurred judgment. Familiarity bred assumptions. Azie kept personal emotions separate from business as much as possible, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. He had seen too many people compromise their safety by trusting feelings over facts. The streets also enforced rules about silence in the face of authority. Cooperation with law enforcement was the ultimate violation, the one that erased all other considerations. Fear made informants, and informants destroyed entire networks. Azie remained acutely aware of this risk, limiting what others knew about him and what he knew about others. Compartmentalization was survival. There were moments when loyalty was tested unexpectedly. Someone hesitated. Someone disappeared. Someone began asking questions that felt slightly off. Azie learned not to react immediately. He gathered information quietly, observing patterns rather than isolated incidents. Rash responses created chaos. Patience preserved options. Despite the constant undercurrent of suspicion, there were instances of genuine mutual respect. Shared experiences under pressure forged bonds that, while never unconditional, carried weight. These alliances provided support during difficult moments, offering resources, warnings, or simple presence when needed. Azie valued these connections, but he never depended on them entirely. The longer he stayed in the game, the clearer it became that the streets rewarded those who understood human behavior as much as logistics. Deals failed not because of math, but because of ego. Conflicts escalated not because of necessity, but because of pride. Azie avoided these traps by keeping his sense of self separate from his role. He did not need to win every interaction to feel secure. The unspoken rules extended beyond hustling into everyday conduct. How you carried yourself in public. How you responded to disrespect, real or perceived. How you handled loss. Harlem watched everything. People formed opinions quickly and rarely revised them. Azie's steady demeanor earned him a reputation for composure, something that quietly discouraged unnecessary challenges. Yet even with careful navigation, uncertainty remained. Alliances shifted. New players entered the scene. Old ones fell away. The game evolved constantly, and Azie had to evolve with it. He accepted that control was limited, that preparation was the best defense available. By internalizing these rules and managing his relationships with care, Azie Faison strengthened his position without drawing excessive attention. He became known not as the loudest or the most feared, but as someone who understood the deeper mechanics of survival. In a world where words could kill and silence could save, this understanding was invaluable. As the years moved forward and the pressure around Harlem intensified, these alliances and rules would be tested again and again. Some would hold. Others would fracture. But the foundation Azie built, rooted in observation, restraint, and respect for the unspoken code, would continue to guide him through a landscape where missteps were unforgiving and trust was always provisional. By the time the crack era fully tightened its grip on Harlem, the neighborhood no longer felt like a place merely struggling at the margins. It felt like a pressure cooker, sealed and heating steadily, with no clear way to release the steam. What had once been an underground economy became impossible to ignore. The pace quickened, the stakes rose, and the cost of mistakes grew sharper with each passing month. For those living inside it, the change was gradual enough to seem normal, yet dramatic enough to leave scars everywhere. Crack altered the rhythm of the streets. Transactions that once took time became rapid and relentless. Corners that had been quiet for hours now buzzed constantly. The flow of money increased, but so did desperation. Addiction created a demand that never slept, and that demand reshaped behavior on every level. Azie Faison watched as familiar faces changed, as hunger replaced patience, and as survival instincts overrode judgment. What made this period especially dangerous was the illusion of opportunity. For many, crack seemed like a shortcut out of poverty, a fast lane toward financial freedom. The money was real, and it came quickly. But so did everything else: violence, law enforcement attention, internal conflict. The streets became crowded with new players who lacked experience but carried ambition and fear in equal measure. Azie observed these changes with growing caution. He understood that the same forces creating opportunity were also accelerating collapse. The infrastructure of the streets strained under the volume. Trust eroded faster. Disputes escalated more quickly. Where patience once solved problems, now impatience ruled. The community itself began to feel the weight. Families fractured under the pressure of addiction. Businesses suffered as theft and instability increased. Elders watched helplessly as the neighborhood transformed in ways they could not stop. The sense of collective responsibility that once defined Harlem weakened, replaced by a survival mindset that isolated individuals from one another. For those involved in hustling, the crack era demanded adaptation. Old methods no longer worked. Low volume, steady operations struggled to compete with the sheer scale of the new market. Some hustlers expanded aggressively, believing that growth was protection. Others doubled down on secrecy, trying to avoid being swallowed by the chaos. Azie leaned toward the latter approach, understanding that visibility was now more dangerous than ever. Law enforcement responded predictably. Increased patrols, undercover operations, and heavier sentencing became common. The streets felt watched in a way they hadn't before. Conversations grew shorter, meetings more discreet. Paranoia seeped into every interaction. Anyone could be an informant. Any routine could be a setup. This environment rewarded those who could remain calm and think clearly under pressure. Azie felt the psychological shift as much as the practical one. The constant motion left little room for reflection. Decisions had to be made quickly, yet the margin for error shrank. He learned to slow himself internally, even as the world around him sped up. This internal stillness became a crucial survival tool. The crack era also blurred moral lines in ways that troubled even seasoned hustlers. The devastation caused by addiction was visible everywhere, on sidewalks, in apartment hallways, in the hollowed expressions of people who had once been neighbors and friends. For some, this reality hardened their resolve. For others, it planted seeds of doubt. Azie did not ignore what he saw. He carried it quietly, letting it inform his sense of caution rather than push him toward denial. Competition intensified not just between rival operations, but within them. Greed created fractures. Short-term thinking replaced long-term planning. People took risks they never would have considered before, driven by the belief that the moment would not last. In many cases, they were right, but not in the way they expected. Violence became more frequent, but also more unpredictable. Disputes erupted over smaller issues. Respect, once carefully negotiated, was now demanded aggressively. Azie recognized this as a sign of instability. When fear replaces structure, chaos follows. He adjusted his movements accordingly, avoiding hotspots and unnecessary exposure. Despite the turmoil, the money kept coming. This contradiction defined the era. Prosperity and destruction existed side by side, inseparable. For Azie, this duality reinforced his belief that the streets could not be trusted to sustain anyone indefinitely. What they gave, they would eventually reclaim, often with interest. As the years progressed, the crack era reshaped not only Harlem, but the psychology of those who survived it. Hypervigilance became normal. Loss became expected. Planning for the future felt abstract when the present demanded constant attention. Azie resisted this mindset as much as he could, holding on to a longer view even as others narrowed their focus to immediate survival. He also noticed how quickly myths formed during this time. Stories exaggerated success, minimized consequences, and erased the quiet suffering that underpinned the entire economy. These myths attracted newcomers, perpetuating the cycle. Azie did not contribute to these narratives. He understood that glamorizing the game only fed the machine that destroyed people. The crack era was not just a chapter in Harlem's history, it was a force that rewired the neighborhood's social fabric. It rewarded speed over wisdom, volume over discretion. For those who failed to adapt, the cost was severe. For those who adapted too well, the cost was often their humanity. Azie stood at the intersection of these pressures, navigating a landscape that offered immense reward and equally immense risk. He did not see the era as an opportunity to conquer, but as a storm to be endured. His choices during this time, his restraint, his awareness, his refusal to be swept up in the frenzy, would prove critical. As the crack era reached its peak, Harlem felt both alive and dying at the same time. The streets pulsed with energy, money, and danger, while the community beneath struggled to breathe. Azie moved through this environment carefully, aware that the same current carrying him forward could just as easily pull him under. The question was no longer whether the era would end, but who would still be standing when it did. Section 8 KO expand Caro 1100 plus word without any headings and numbers. By the time the calendar turned toward 1991, Harlem carried a different kind of weight. The energy of the crack era had not disappeared, but it had hardened. What once felt chaotic now felt constricted, as if invisible walls were slowly closing in from every direction. The streets were still busy, still loud, still driven by money and desperation, yet beneath that noise ran a steady current of tension that never fully lifted, even in the quietest hours before dawn. For Azie Faison, this shift was unmistakable. He could feel it in the way conversations ended abruptly, in the way people scanned their surroundings before speaking, in the way familiar routines suddenly felt risky. The city no longer moved with the loose rhythm he had learned to navigate. Everything felt tighter, monitored, compressed. Harlem had entered a phase where mistakes were no longer absorbed quietly, they were exposed. Law enforcement presence intensified in ways that were impossible to ignore. Patrol cars lingered longer on corners. Unmarked vehicles blended into the background, their presence felt more than seen. Raids became more frequent, their impact rippling outward through the neighborhood. Entire operations vanished overnight, leaving behind empty apartments and unanswered questions. Fear traveled faster than information, filling the gaps with speculation. Azie responded to this pressure by slowing down. Where others pushed harder, he pulled back, evaluating every move with renewed caution. He understood that periods of heightened enforcement often produced panic, and panic led to errors. His goal was not to outrun the moment, but to outlast it. This required discipline and a willingness to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term survival. The tightening of the streets also brought internal strain. Trust, already fragile, weakened further. People grew suspicious of one another, second-guessing motives and loyalty. Informants became an ever-present fear, real or imagined. A single arrest could unravel entire networks if someone chose self-preservation over silence. Azie compartmentalized his interactions even more carefully, limiting exposure wherever possible. The atmosphere affected even those not directly involved. Ordinary residents felt the pressure through increased police encounters, disrupted routines, and a constant sense of unease. Harlem's energy shifted from restless to wary. The neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. Within the hustle, competition grew sharper. As opportunities narrowed, desperation increased. Some hustlers responded by expanding recklessly, believing that bigger operations offered protection. Others turned on former allies, looking for leverage or advantage. Azie watched these developments closely, recognizing them as signs of instability rather than strength. Violence during this period carried a different tone. It was less about dominance and more about fear. Confrontations escalated quickly, fueled by paranoia and scarcity. Azie avoided unnecessary interactions, understanding that even minor disputes could spiral out of control. His movements became more calculated, his presence more selective. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. Nights were punctuated by distant sirens, sudden noises, and the constant awareness that circumstances could change instantly. This vigilance was exhausting, but it was also essential. Azie accepted it as part of the price of survival, refusing to let fatigue dull his instincts. 1991 also marked a psychological turning point. The illusion of endless opportunity faded. The streets no longer felt like a place where one could build indefinitely. They felt temporary, unstable, and increasingly hostile. For Azie, this realization sharpened his focus on exit strategies, even if he could not yet act on them fully. He began to notice how quickly people disappeared during this time. Some were arrested, their names whispered and then avoided. Others simply vanished, leaving behind rumors and silence. Each absence served as a reminder of how thin the line between presence and erasure had become. The pressure extended beyond Harlem. Policies shifted, sentencing laws hardened, and the broader system moved decisively against street-level operations. This was not a localized crackdown, it was a coordinated effort that left little room for error. Azie understood that the game was changing at a structural level, not just on the streets. Despite the tightening environment, money still moved, though less predictably. Deals took longer to arrange. Routes changed frequently. Trust became transactional and fleeting. Azie adapted by reducing complexity, favoring simplicity over expansion. Fewer moving parts meant fewer points of failure. Emotionally, the strain of this period was cumulative. Constant vigilance, compounded by the loss of peers and the erosion of stability, took its toll. Azie did not ignore these feelings, but he did not let them control him. He treated stress as information, a signal that conditions were deteriorating. Harlem in 1991 felt like a place at a crossroads, though no one could say exactly where the road led. The past was closing in, the future uncertain. The present demanded absolute attention. Azie moved through this landscape with care, aware that survival now depended less on opportunity and more on restraint. Every decision carried amplified consequences. Every interaction required calculation. The margin for error had nearly vanished. Yet within this pressure, Azie's discipline proved invaluable. His ability to remain calm, to observe rather than react, allowed him to navigate a year that swallowed many others. As the streets tightened, the question was no longer who could rise higher, but who could endure the squeeze. Azie Faison understood this distinction clearly. 1991 was not about expansion or ambition. It was about staying invisible, staying alive, and waiting for the moment when the pressure would finally ease, or break. As the streets grew tighter and the pressure of 1991 pressed down on Harlem, danger began to take on new forms. It no longer announced itself only through rival hustlers or visible confrontations. Increasingly, the most serious threats arrived quietly, disguised as routine, familiarity, or opportunity. For Azie Faison, this shift marked one of the most mentally demanding phases of his life in the game. Survival now depended not just on avoiding obvious enemies, but on recognizing danger before it revealed itself. The fear of informants became a constant undercurrent. Anyone could be facing pressure, anyone could be bargaining for their freedom. Arrests no longer felt isolated, they felt connected, like the first tug on a thread that could unravel everything. Azie noticed how conversations changed after certain names disappeared. People spoke less, listened more, and watched each other with guarded eyes. Silence became both protection and suspicion. Law enforcement strategies grew more sophisticated. Undercover operations blended seamlessly into everyday life. People who seemed ordinary, forgettable, even friendly, could be collecting information piece by piece. Azie learned to assume nothing. Familiarity no longer equaled safety. The rules he had relied on earlier, territory, reputation, mutual understanding, offered less protection than before. Even trusted relationships came under strain. Pressure exposed fault lines and alliances that once seemed stable. Some people grew anxious and unpredictable. Others became overly cautious, withdrawing suddenly without explanation. Azie resisted the urge to interpret these shifts emotionally. He understood that fear made people behave inconsistently. Reacting impulsively could create more danger than the original threat. Rivalries also evolved. Competition was no longer just about control or profit. It became about survival. In an environment where resources felt limited, some hustlers saw eliminating others as a way to reduce risk. These conflicts often erupted unexpectedly, without the buildup that once allowed for warning. Azie adjusted by avoiding patterns, changing routines, and limiting exposure. The most unsettling realization was that danger often came from within one's own circle. A careless comment, an overheard conversation, a moment of misplaced trust, any of these could be exploited. Azie became meticulous about what he shared and with whom. He compartmentalized his life further, ensuring that no single person held enough information to compromise him completely. Psychologically, this period demanded constant vigilance. The mind never fully rested. Every interaction required analysis, tone, timing, context. Was someone asking too many questions? Was a situation unfolding too smoothly? Azie learned to trust his instincts, especially when something felt slightly off without clear explanation. Those subtle signals often mattered most. Despite the tension, he avoided paranoia. Excessive suspicion could be as dangerous as complacency. Accusing the wrong person, cutting off the wrong connection, or overreacting to incomplete information could isolate him or provoke unnecessary conflict. Azie aimed for balance, alert but controlled, cautious but not frozen. He also recognized the importance of adaptability. The enemies he faced were not fixed. Threats shifted as circumstances changed. Someone harmless one month could become dangerous the next, driven by pressure or opportunity. Azie remained flexible, ready to adjust his approach as new information emerged. The environment reinforced the idea that survival was less about strength and more about awareness. Many who fell during this period were not reckless in the traditional sense. They were predictable. They followed routines, trusted patterns, and assumed yesterday's rules still applied. Azie avoided these traps by constantly reassessing his surroundings. Harlem itself reflected this tension. The streets felt quieter in some ways, yet more volatile in others. People avoided eye contact, moved quickly, and spoke in fragments. The sense of community that once provided informal protection eroded further. Isolation became common, even among those who worked together. The emotional toll of living under constant threat accumulated slowly. Moments of calm were fleeting, easily interrupted by the awareness that safety was temporary. Azie learned to carry this weight without letting it show. Displaying stress could signal vulnerability. Maintaining composure became as important as any logistical decision. There were times when Azie sensed danger but could not identify its source. These moments were the most difficult to manage. Acting too soon risked exposing himself unnecessarily. Waiting too long risked missing the chance to avoid harm. He relied on patience, observation, and incremental adjustments rather than dramatic changes. Through all of this, Azie remained focused on survival rather than dominance. He did not seek to eliminate enemies or assert control. His goal was to remain untangled, to avoid becoming a focal point for conflict or scrutiny. This approach reduced immediate risk, though it required constant effort. The realization that enemies often remained invisible changed how Azie viewed the game entirely. It stripped away any remaining illusion of control. No matter how careful he was, some factors remained beyond his influence. Accepting this reality allowed him to concentrate on what he could manage, his own behavior, his own choices. As 1991 progressed, the line between ally and adversary blurred. Everyone navigated the same pressure cooker, and not everyone would respond with integrity. Azie understood that survival during this period depended on restraint, discretion, and an unwavering commitment to staying alert. The danger he faced was no longer loud or obvious. It whispered through uncertainty, hid behind routine, and waited patiently for mistakes. Recognizing this truth marked a critical evolution in Azie Faison's journey. The streets were no longer just a place of opportunity and risk, they were a psychological battlefield where the unseen often proved deadlier than the known. By the time Azie Faison reached this stage of his life in the streets, survival had become as much a mental discipline as a physical one. The dangers around him were no longer limited to external threats that could be anticipated or avoided with careful movement. Increasingly, the real battle took place internally, in the quiet moments when decisions were made, impulses restrained, and fear managed. The psychology of survival shaped every aspect of his daily life, demanding constant self-control in an environment designed to provoke reaction. Azie learned early that emotion was a liability. Anger narrowed vision. Excitement clouded judgment. Fear, if left unchecked, led to panic. Each of these emotions could trigger decisions that unraveled months or years of careful work. He trained himself to observe his own reactions, to pause before acting, to create distance between feeling and response. This discipline did not come naturally, it was developed through repeated exposure to stress and the consequences of watching others lose control. One of the most difficult challenges was resisting ego. The streets rewarded confidence, but they punished arrogance. Many hustlers confused visibility with power, mistaking recognition for respect. Azie avoided this trap by keeping his sense of identity separate from his role in the game. He did not need validation from peers or rivals. His measure of success was simple and quiet, staying free and alive. Patience became his most valuable asset. In a world driven by urgency, the ability to wait created advantage. Azie understood that not every situation required immediate action. Often, time revealed information that haste obscured. He learned to sit with uncertainty, to allow situations to unfold before committing to a course of action. This restraint protected him from impulsive decisions that carried irreversible consequences. The constant need for vigilance reshaped his perception of normalcy. Ordinary moments, walking down the street, sitting in a car, answering a phone, carried layers of meaning. He evaluated environments instinctively, noting exits, changes in atmosphere, subtle shifts in behavior. This heightened awareness became second nature, though it came at the cost of relaxation. Sleep, when it arrived, was light and fragmented. The mind rarely disengaged fully, remaining alert even in rest. Azie adapted to this state, understanding that deep comfort was incompatible with his circumstances. Rather than fighting it, he accepted vigilance as a temporary condition necessary for survival. Another crucial aspect of his psychological approach was acceptance of uncertainty. Control in the streets was always limited. No amount of planning could eliminate risk entirely. Azie acknowledged this reality without letting it paralyze him. He focused on reducing exposure rather than seeking complete safety, recognizing that perfection was impossible. He also developed an acute sense of self-awareness. He monitored his own behavior closely, noting when stress increased or when decision-making felt rushed. These signals served as warnings that adjustments were needed. Stepping back, simplifying operations, or temporarily disengaging became tools for maintaining balance. Azie paid attention to the mental states of those around him as well. Fear manifested differently in different people, some became reckless, others withdrawn. Recognizing these patterns helped him anticipate potential problems. A sudden change in someone's behavior often indicated pressure, and pressure increased risk for everyone involved. The psychology of survival also involved maintaining perspective. The streets encouraged short-term thinking, rewarding immediate gain over long-term stability. Azie resisted this pull by keeping an eye on the broader trajectory of his life. He reminded himself that the hustle was not an identity, but a phase. This distinction helped him avoid decisions that traded future freedom for present comfort. Isolation was another psychological challenge. Trust was limited, and meaningful connection was rare. Carrying this weight alone required resilience. Azie found ways to ground himself, holding on to routines and small elements of normal life that anchored him emotionally. These anchors provided relief from the constant tension, even if only briefly. He also confronted the quiet fear that came with understanding the game too well. Knowledge stripped away illusion. He could no longer pretend that success guaranteed safety or that careful planning ensured immunity. This awareness was sobering, but it also clarified his priorities. Survival became the central goal, outweighing ambition or pride. The mental discipline required during this period was exhausting, yet it sharpened Azie's instincts. He became adept at recognizing patterns, predicting outcomes, and avoiding unnecessary exposure. These skills did not make him invulnerable, but they increased his margin for error. As the years of pressure accumulated, Azie's mindset shifted further toward preservation. The thrill that once accompanied success faded, replaced by a desire for stability and distance. This psychological shift marked an important turning point. It signaled readiness for change, even if the path forward was not yet clear. In an environment where many were undone by their own impulses, Azie's ability to regulate himself became his greatest advantage. He understood that the streets exploited weakness, and that weakness often originated within. By mastering his reactions, his expectations, and his sense of self, he navigated a landscape that consumed others. The psychology of survival was not about fearlessness. It was about awareness, restraint, and the willingness to endure discomfort without seeking escape through reckless behavior. For Azie Faison, this internal discipline allowed him to remain steady as the world around him grew increasingly unstable, setting the stage for decisions that would ultimately define the rare outcome of his story. There came a point when the money no longer felt like protection. At first, it had represented relief, a buffer against the constant scarcity that defined childhood and early adulthood. Later, it became a measure of stability, proof that discipline and patience could produce results. But as time passed and the streets tightened, that feeling shifted. Cash stopped bringing comfort and began to carry weight, heavy and unsettling, like something that needed to be guarded rather than enjoyed. For Azie Faison, this change was gradual but undeniable. The same stacks of money that once felt empowering now demanded attention. Where would it be kept? Who knew about it? What did its presence attract? Each question introduced new risk. Wealth in the streets was never just wealth, it was a signal, and signals drew interest from both rivals and authorities. The sense of unease grew as Azie watched others fall despite their earnings. He saw men with more money than they could spend lose everything overnight. Some were taken by law enforcement, their assets seized and lives rerouted into long sentences. Others became targets, their success interpreted as provocation. The streets made no distinction between earned and flaunted wealth, visibility was enough. This reality altered how Azie related to money. He stopped associating it with security. Instead, he viewed it as something temporary, something that could vanish as quickly as it arrived. This perspective reduced attachment, making it easier to prioritize survival over accumulation. The practical burdens of managing money also increased. Larger sums required more complex handling. Storage became a concern. Movement required discretion. Mistakes carried higher stakes. Azie found himself devoting mental energy to protecting assets rather than enjoying them, a trade-off that highlighted the hollowness of financial success in an unstable environment. Emotionally, the presence of money created distance. Friends and acquaintances viewed him differently, even when he maintained a low profile. Assumptions formed. Expectations grew. Some sought assistance. Others harbored resentment. Navigating these dynamics required careful balance, helping too much invited dependency, refusing too often bred hostility. Azie also became aware of how money amplified stress. Decisions felt heavier when more was at stake. Risk tolerance narrowed. Each choice carried the potential for greater loss. The mental calculus grew more complex, turning even routine actions into sources of tension. Sleep suffered further. The mind replayed scenarios, imagined threats, considered contingencies. The knowledge that money could make him a target lingered in quiet moments. He learned to live with this awareness, but it eroded any remaining sense of ease. There was also a deeper, more personal realization taking shape. The money had not delivered what it implicitly promised. It had not created peace. It had not erased fear. It had not offered a future free from the streets. Instead, it bound him more tightly to an environment that grew increasingly hostile. This recognition did not come with regret, but with clarity. Azie understood that money was a tool, not a destination. Used carefully, it could facilitate transition. Used carelessly, it could trap him. This distinction sharpened his thinking about the future. He began to imagine life beyond the hustle more seriously. Not in detailed plans, but in quiet considerations. What would it mean to live without constant vigilance? To sleep without listening for sirens? To exist without calculating every interaction? These thoughts surfaced more often, especially during moments when the stress felt most acute. The contrast between appearance and reality became stark. From the outside, success might look enviable. From within, it felt precarious. Azie recognized that many people chased an image without understanding its cost. He had paid that cost and found the return insufficient. This shift in perception influenced his behavior. He reduced exposure further, avoided unnecessary transactions, and focused on preserving options. Growth was no longer the objective. Stability and exit became increasingly important. He also re-evaluated relationships through this lens. Who added value beyond profit? Who increased risk without offering protection? These assessments were not emotional judgments, but strategic ones. Survival required honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. The realization that money no longer felt safe marked a critical turning point. It stripped away remaining illusions and forced a reckoning. The streets had provided opportunity, but they demanded a price that continued to rise. Azie was no longer willing to pay indefinitely. This period was marked by quiet resolve rather than dramatic change. He did not announce his intentions or make sudden moves. He allowed the understanding to settle, letting it guide decisions subtly and consistently. The awareness that money could not protect him became a compass, pointing away from deeper involvement and toward something else, even if the path forward remained uncertain. In the stillness of late nights, with the city humming softly beyond the window, Azie felt the weight of this realization most clearly. The money sat nearby, tangible yet hollow. It represented survival so far, but not safety moving forward. And in that recognition lay the beginning of a new question: how to leave a game that never truly lets go, and whether survival could mean more than just staying alive. As the years pressed forward and the streets continued to tighten their grip, absence became one of the most common features of Azie Faison's world. It arrived quietly at first, barely noticeable, then more frequently, until it became impossible to ignore. One day a familiar face would be present, part of the background rhythm of the neighborhood. The next day, that face would be gone, leaving behind questions no one asked out loud. Watching others fall was not a single event but a steady accumulation of losses. Arrests came without warning. Raids swept through apartments and storefronts, stripping entire operations down to nothing in a matter of hours. Names that once carried weight were suddenly spoken in past tense, if they were spoken at all. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable, filling the spaces where confidence once lived. Azie observed these disappearances with a growing sense of inevitability. He did not take comfort in outlasting others. Survival did not feel like victory when it was measured against the losses around him. Each fall served as a reminder of how thin the margin for error had become, and how temporary any sense of control truly was. Some fell because they were reckless. Others fell despite being careful. This randomness was what troubled Azie most. The streets did not always punish the worst behavior or reward the best judgment. Sometimes timing alone decided outcomes. Being in the wrong place on the wrong day could undo years of discipline. The emotional impact of these losses was subtle but cumulative. Funerals blended into one another. Court dates replaced celebrations. Conversations shifted from plans to speculation. Who was next? Who had talked? Who had made a mistake? These questions lingered without answers, fueling anxiety and mistrust. Azie resisted the urge to romanticize these downfalls. There was nothing heroic about watching lives unravel. The reality was stark: families left behind, futures cut short, potential wasted. Even those who survived carried scars that would never fully heal. The streets collected payment from everyone eventually, in one form or another. He paid close attention to patterns. Certain behaviors appeared repeatedly among those who fell. Overconfidence. Complacency. The belief that past success guaranteed future safety. Azie took these observations seriously, adjusting his own behavior to avoid similar traps. There were also moments of personal loss. People he had worked with, laughed with, trusted in limited ways, vanished from his life. Some were incarcerated, their voices reduced to occasional phone calls or letters. Others disappeared entirely, their fate uncertain. These losses created a quiet grief that had no outlet. In the streets, mourning was private, unacknowledged. The fall of others also affected the environment. As experienced hustlers were removed, gaps formed, inviting new, less disciplined players. This shift increased volatility. Inexperience bred mistakes, and mistakes attracted attention. The cycle accelerated, making the streets even more dangerous. Azie understood that witnessing these downfalls was itself a lesson. The streets were offering a preview of possible outcomes. He studied these examples not with detachment, but with intent. Each fall reinforced the urgency of restraint and the importance of exit planning. At times, survivors' guilt surfaced quietly. Why him? Why had he remained while others had not? Azie did not dwell on these questions, but they lingered in the background, adding weight to his decisions. Survival felt undeserved at times, accidental rather than earned. The psychological effect of constant loss was exhausting. Trust eroded further. Optimism faded. The future narrowed. Azie felt the pressure of time more acutely, aware that staying too long increased the likelihood of becoming another absence. He also noticed how quickly the streets forgot. Names that once commanded respect faded from memory within weeks. New stories replaced old ones. This impermanence stripped away any illusion of legacy within the game. No matter how significant someone seemed at their peak, the streets moved on without pause. This realization was sobering. It underscored the emptiness of chasing recognition in an environment that erased its own history so easily. Azie internalized this lesson, further distancing his sense of self from his role in the hustle. Watching others fall did not harden him, it clarified him. It sharpened his awareness of consequences and reinforced his desire for a different outcome. He did not want to be remembered as a cautionary tale or a faded name. He wanted to be present, alive, and free. The accumulation of these losses marked a turning point. The streets were no longer just risky, they were unsustainable. The cost of staying continued to rise, while the rewards diminished. Azie began to see the end of his involvement not as an abstract possibility, but as a necessary step. As he moved through Harlem, the absence of familiar faces became a constant reminder. Each empty corner, each silent phone, each unanswered question reinforced the same truth: the game always ended, and rarely on favorable terms. For Azie Faison, watching others fall was not a spectacle. It was a warning delivered repeatedly, patiently, until it could no longer be ignored. The message was clear, even if the path forward was not yet fully formed. Survival required change, and change would require courage equal to anything the streets had demanded so far. Leaving the streets was never a single decision. It was not a dramatic moment marked by a final deal or a clean break. For Azie Faison, the idea of exiting the game formed slowly, quietly, through a series of realizations that accumulated over time. Each loss he witnessed, each close call he avoided, added weight to the same conclusion: staying any longer meant gambling against odds that only grew worse. The thought of leaving was complicated by the simple truth that the streets did not encourage exits. There was no formal retirement, no ceremony, no guarantee of safety on the other side. Walking away carried its own risks. People became suspicious when someone stepped back. Motives were questioned. Absence invited curiosity, and curiosity could be dangerous. Azie understood this, which is why he approached the idea of leaving with the same caution he had applied to every other aspect of his survival. He did not announce intentions or make sudden moves. He allowed the shift to happen gradually, reducing exposure piece by piece, loosening his ties without drawing attention. One of the greatest challenges was letting go of identity. The hustle had shaped his daily life, his routines, his sense of competence. Stepping away meant redefining himself outside of an environment that had demanded constant engagement. This psychological adjustment was as difficult as any logistical challenge. Money, once again, played a complex role. It provided options, but it also raised questions. How could funds be used without drawing scrutiny? How could he transition without signaling vulnerability? Azie navigated these questions carefully, understanding that missteps during exit could be more dangerous than those made while fully active. There was also the matter of relationships. Some connections faded naturally as his involvement decreased. Others required delicate handling. People accustomed to his presence might interpret distance as betrayal or concealment. Azie managed these dynamics quietly, avoiding conflict while maintaining boundaries. The fear of retaliation or suspicion lingered. In a world where informants were hunted and rivals settled scores without warning, any change in behavior could be misinterpreted. Azie countered this by remaining consistent in demeanor, even as his actions shifted. Calmness and predictability masked deeper changes. Internally, the process was emotionally complex. Relief mingled with anxiety. Hope existed alongside uncertainty. The streets had provided structure, however dangerous, and stepping into the unknown felt unsettling. Azie acknowledged these feelings without letting them derail his plan. He also understood that leaving did not mean erasing the past. Memories, habits, and instincts would follow him. The vigilance he had developed would not disappear overnight. Accepting this reality helped him approach the transition realistically rather than idealistically. The timing of his exit mattered. Too early, and he risked unfinished business and unresolved tensions. Too late, and circumstances might remove the option entirely. Azie waited for a moment that felt as stable as possible, even if true stability was never guaranteed. As his involvement waned, he noticed subtle shifts in his daily life. Less tension in his movements. Slightly deeper sleep on certain nights. Moments of calm that felt unfamiliar but welcome. These changes reinforced his belief that stepping away was the right choice. There were moments of doubt. The streets had conditioned him to expect danger, and quiet sometimes felt suspicious. He resisted the urge to re-engage simply to relieve anxiety. Instead, he leaned into patience, trusting the process he had set in motion. Azie did not romanticize the exit. He understood that life after the hustle would bring its own challenges. Financial adjustments, psychological recalibration, and rebuilding identity would require effort. But these challenges felt manageable compared to the constant threat of disappearance. Walking away also meant accepting anonymity. The recognition that once carried weight would fade. For many, this loss was unbearable. For Azie, it was liberating. Being unnoticed felt like a form of protection, a return to simplicity. The exit unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. There was no final confrontation, no announcement. Just a steady reduction in involvement until the streets no longer defined his days. This subtlety was intentional. The less attention the transition attracted, the safer it remained. By choosing this path, Azie Faison did something few managed to do. He left before the streets decided his fate for him. The courage required for this decision was different from the bravado often celebrated in street lore. It was the courage to relinquish control, to step into uncertainty, and to redefine survival on his own terms. As the distance between him and the hustle grew, Azie carried forward the lessons he had learned: discipline, awareness, restraint, while leaving behind the constant danger. The exit was not an ending, but a transformation, one that marked the beginning of a life shaped not by the streets, but by the rare act of choosing to leave them behind. Life after the hustle did not arrive with clarity or immediate relief. It came quietly, almost cautiously, as if unsure whether it was welcome. For Azie Faison, the absence of constant pressure felt unfamiliar, even unsettling at first. The streets had dictated his rhythms for so long that stepping outside of them created a strange vacuum, one that took time to understand and fill. The first adjustment was internal. His mind, conditioned to remain alert, struggled to slow down. Ordinary sounds still triggered instinctive responses. A sudden noise could sharpen his focus instantly, heart rate rising before reason intervened. This hypervigilance had once been essential, and now it lingered as a habit, a reminder of where he had been. Sleep changed gradually. Nights were still light at first, but over time, the tension softened. The constant calculations that once filled his thoughts began to fade, replaced by longer stretches of quiet. These moments felt fragile, as though they could be interrupted at any time. Azie learned to appreciate them without expecting permanence. Daily life required rebuilding from the ground up. Without the hustle structure, he had to create new routines. Simple decisions, how to spend time, where to go, who to interact with, took on new significance. Freedom carried responsibility, and responsibility demanded intention. Financially, adjustment was necessary. Money that once flowed unpredictably now had to be managed with foresight. Stability replaced volume as the goal. Azie approached this transition with the same discipline that had guided him before, understanding that long-term security depended on restraint and planning. Social relationships shifted as well. Some connections dissolved naturally, tied too closely to the life he had left behind. Others remained, though redefined by new boundaries. Azie navigated these changes carefully, aware that trust would need to be rebuilt in a different context. Identity became an ongoing question. Without the hustle, who was he? This question did not demand an immediate answer, but it lingered. Azie explored new ways of defining himself, through interests, responsibilities, and the simple act of living without constant threat. There were moments of nostalgia, not for the danger, but for the intensity. The hustle had provided a sense of purpose, however flawed. Letting go of that intensity required patience. Azie resisted the temptation to fill the void with unnecessary risk or distraction. The outside world moved differently. Time stretched. Days felt longer, less urgent. This slower pace was both comforting and challenging. It offered space for reflection, but also required adaptation. Azie learned to sit with quiet moments, allowing them to exist without feeling compelled to act. Emotionally, the transition brought a mix of relief and grief. Relief at having escaped outcomes that claimed so many others. Grief for lost friends, lost years, and paths not taken. These emotions surfaced unpredictably, often in quiet moments when defenses were down. Azie did not attempt to erase his past. He understood that his experiences had shaped him in lasting ways. Instead, he focused on integrating those lessons into a new life. Awareness became caution rather than fear. Discipline became consistency rather than rigidity. Community interactions felt different as well. Without the shadow of the streets, relationships could be simpler, though not without complexity. Azie learned to engage without suspicion, to listen without calculating ulterior motives. This adjustment took time, but it gradually restored a sense of normalcy. There was also the challenge of resisting narratives imposed from outside. Stories about the streets often glamorized or simplified experiences that were anything but. Azie maintained his own understanding, grounded in reality rather than myth. As time passed, the distance between his old life and his new one grew. Memories softened, losing their immediacy. The lessons remained, but the urgency faded. Azie found satisfaction in small, steady achievements, consistency, peace, presence. Life after the hustle did not promise ease, but it offered something more valuable, choice. Azie could decide how to spend his time, where to direct his energy, and what kind of future to pursue. This autonomy was a quiet reward, earned through restraint and timing. The transition was not without setbacks. Moments of doubt surfaced, especially when challenges arose. But Azie reminded himself that difficulty without danger was a privilege. Struggles now came with options, not ultimatums. In this new chapter, survival took on a different meaning. It was no longer about evasion or vigilance. It was about stability, growth, and the freedom to exist without constant fear. For Azie Faison, life after the hustle was not an escape from reality, but an arrival into a version of it that allowed room to breathe, to reflect, and to continue forward on his own terms. Long after the most dangerous chapters of Azie Faison's life had passed, his name found a second life in an unexpected place. Not on the streets, and not in court documents, but on movie screens and in cultural conversations far removed from the reality that shaped him. When Paid in Full emerged, it brought with it a wave of attention that reframed Harlem's crack-era history into something stylized, compressed, and emotionally charged. For many viewers, the film became the definitive version of that time. For Azie, it was a reminder of how easily reality becomes legend. The film did not invent its world out of nothing. It drew inspiration from real people, real streets, and real consequences. The characters, though fictionalized, carried echoes of lives that had unfolded in Harlem during the height of the crack era. For audiences unfamiliar with that history, the story felt raw and authentic. For those who lived it, the portrayal felt incomplete. Cinema has its own logic. It favors momentum over patience, conflict over silence, spectacle over restraint. The real hustle rarely moves that way. It is repetitive, cautious, and often uneventful. Much of Azie's survival depended on what did not happen: deals avoided, conflicts diffused, attention sidestepped. These moments do not translate easily to film. In Paid in Full, the rise is swift and dramatic. Money arrives quickly. Power feels immediate. The characters appear to control their environment, at least for a time. In reality, control was always partial, always fragile. The streets allowed temporary success, but they never surrendered authority. This distinction is subtle, but it matters. The film's popularity created a mythology that reshaped how people remembered the era. Viewers gravitated toward the boldest moments, the cars, the clothes, the confrontations. These images became symbols, stripped of context. The quieter truths, the exhaustion, the paranoia, the constant calculation, were harder to capture and easier to forget. For Azie, watching his world transformed into entertainment was disorienting. His life had been defined by caution and restraint, yet the narrative that reached the public emphasized risk and bravado. The choices that allowed him to survive did not make for dramatic scenes. They made for absence: no gunfire, no spectacle, no final showdown. This contrast highlighted the gap between myth and lived experience. The streets were not a stage for performance. They were an environment that demanded humility. Many who tried to live up to the myth paid for it dearly. The legend encouraged imitation without understanding, and understanding was the difference between survival and disappearance. The cultural impact of Paid in Full extended beyond storytelling. It influenced fashion, music, and language. It became a reference point, shaping how a new generation imagined an era they had not lived through. For some, it inspired admiration. For others, it served as a cautionary tale. Often, it did both at once. Azie remained largely silent as the myth grew. He did not rush to correct narratives or claim ownership of inspiration. Silence had served him well before, and it continued to do so. He understood that public clarification rarely dismantles myth. Once a story takes hold, it belongs to its audience. Privately, however, the distinction between myth and man remained clear. The film captured moments of truth, but it could not capture the full weight of consequence. It could not convey how narrow survival margins were, or how many intelligent, capable people were lost despite doing many things right. There was also a strange irony in seeing fictional characters celebrated for traits that, in real life, often led to ruin. Aggression, dominance, and visibility made compelling cinema, but they shortened lives. The real lessons of the era, patience, discretion, emotional control, were less glamorous, but far more valuable. For Azie, the film became a marker of distance. It represented a chapter of life that had closed, transformed into something abstract and symbolic. The streets he remembered no longer existed in the same way. Harlem had changed, and so had he. The myth belonged to the past, survival belonged to the present. He recognized that stories like Paid in Full served a purpose. They preserved memory, even if imperfectly. They sparked conversation. They reminded people that an era existed, that lives were shaped and lost within it. But he also understood their limitations. Entertainment simplifies. Reality resists simplicity. As time passed, the film's imagery continued to circulate, detached from its origins. Quotes were repeated. Scenes were rewatched. The characters took on lives of their own. Meanwhile, the real people who inspired them moved on quietly, carrying memories that could never be fully translated. The tension between representation and reality did not trouble Azie as much as it might have earlier in life. Perspective softened reaction. He had survived something that many only experienced through a screen. That difference mattered more than recognition or credit. In reflecting on Paid in Full, Azie saw both a distortion and a mirror. The distortion lay in what was amplified and what was omitted. The mirror lay in the emotional truth, the hunger, the ambition, the pressure. Those elements were real, even if the framing was incomplete. Ultimately, the film reinforced a lesson Azie had learned long before: stories grow larger than people. Once released, they take on meanings beyond their origins. Control over narrative is an illusion, much like control over the streets once was. The difference was that this time, the stakes were lower. The myth could circulate without threatening his life. It could exist as a cultural artifact, separate from the man who had lived through the reality behind it. In that separation lay a quiet kind of victory. The legend could belong to history, to film, to conversation. Azie Faison belonged to the present, alive, reflective, and free from the game that so many others only escaped through fiction. With time and distance, the gap between who Azie Faison was and who people imagined him to be grew wider. Stories continued to circulate, shaped by films, street lore, and second-hand retellings, each version smoothing rough edges or sharpening drama to fit a narrative. Somewhere along the way, the man became a symbol, and the symbol began to eclipse the reality. This was the space where myth lived, comfortable and uncomplicated, far removed from the quieter, more complex truth. The myth suggested certainty. It implied confidence without doubt, control without fear, success without consequence. In these retellings, the hustler moved decisively, dominated his environment, and bent circumstances to his will. This image was seductive, especially to those who had never lived inside the pressure it represented. It offered a clear identity and a sense of power that reality rarely delivered. The man, however, lived in uncertainty. Azie's daily existence had been shaped not by domination, but by negotiation. Not by fearlessness, but by caution. His survival depended on acknowledging limits rather than denying them. The myth had no room for hesitation, yet hesitation had often saved his life. In reality, most decisions were not dramatic. They were incremental adjustments made in response to subtle changes in environment. Azie spent more time thinking about what not to do than what to pursue. Avoidance was strategy. Silence was strength. These qualities did not translate easily into legend, but they defined his experience. The myth also simplified motivation. It suggested hunger for wealth or status as primary drivers. In truth, survival played a far greater role. Money was a means to stability, not an end in itself. Prestige was incidental, often unwanted. The idea that anyone entered the game purely for glory ignored the conditions that narrowed choices and reshaped priorities. As stories traveled further from their source, complexity was lost. Contradictions were ironed out. Ambivalence disappeared. The myth required clarity, while the man lived with ambiguity. He carried doubt alongside confidence, fear alongside resolve. These internal tensions were constant companions, rarely acknowledged but always present. The process of myth-making also erased restraint. In stories, restraint appeared passive, even weak. In reality, it required immense discipline. Knowing when not to act demanded self-awareness and patience. Azie had watched countless people undermine themselves by reacting impulsively, driven by pride or anger. His refusal to do the same was not accidental, it was intentional. Another distortion lay in the portrayal of control. The myth implied mastery over circumstances, as though the streets could be managed through will alone. Azie knew better. Control was always partial, temporary, and fragile. External forces, law enforcement, rivals, economic shifts, operated beyond individual influence. Survival meant adapting to these forces, not pretending they did not exist. The man also carried memory in ways the myth could not. He remembered faces, conversations, moments of tension that never made it into stories. He remembered the quiet before sirens, the heaviness of rooms where decisions were made carefully, the exhaustion that followed constant vigilance. These memories lacked spectacle, but they defined his experience more than any dramatic moment. There was also loss. The myth often glossed over it or framed it as inevitable collateral. For Azie, loss was personal and cumulative. Each absence left an imprint. Friends did not become statistics, they became reminders of fragility. These losses shaped his decisions and reinforced his desire to leave before becoming another name recited after the fact. As the years passed, Azie observed how myths influenced behavior. Younger generations encountered the legend without context, absorbing its aesthetics without understanding its cost. Some attempted to emulate what they believed they saw, mistaking visibility for power and aggression for respect. The consequences were often swift and unforgiving. This troubled Azie, though he rarely expressed it openly. He understood that myths could not be controlled once released. Still, the disconnect between narrative and reality felt significant. The story that survived was not the one that taught survival, it was the one that entertained. The man also recognized that myth offered comfort. It created heroes and villains, clear arcs and decisive endings. Reality was messier. It resisted closure. Even survival lacked a clean conclusion, extending into years of adjustment, reflection, and quiet reckoning. The myth ended with a final scene, the man continued living. Over time, Azie came to accept this divergence without resentment. He understood that public narratives served different purposes than personal truth. They preserved memory in broad strokes, even if details were lost. They allowed people to engage with history from a safe distance. They were not meant to capture nuance. For him, the distinction between myth and man became a source of grounding. It reminded him that identity was not defined by perception. His value lay not in recognition, but in experience. He had lived through something that defied easy storytelling, and he had emerged intact. This acceptance brought a quiet sense of freedom. He no longer felt compelled to correct misunderstandings or assert authenticity. His life no longer depended on how it was framed. The myth could circulate independently, while the man remained rooted in the present. The contrast also reinforced a final lesson. The most important parts of his journey were invisible to outsiders. The discipline, the restraint, the patience, these were internal achievements. They did not require acknowledgement to retain their worth. In the end, the myth would continue to evolve, shaped by retellings and reinterpretations. The man would continue to age, reflect, and live. These two paths no longer intersected in ways that mattered. What remained was clarity. Azie Faison understood who he was, separate from what was said about him. He knew what it had taken to survive and what it had cost. That knowledge, quiet and complete, mattered more than any legend ever could. In that separation between myth and man lay the final truth of his story. The real victory was not becoming unforgettable, but becoming free from the need to be remembered at all. By the time Azie Faison had stepped away from the streets, Harlem itself had already begun to transform. The neighborhood that had shaped him, with its narrow sidewalks, fire escapes, and rhythmic energy, was evolving in ways both subtle and dramatic. The block corners where deals had once moved quietly now carried a different tone. Businesses shifted hands, storefronts appeared and disappeared, and the cadence of daily life adjusted to new circumstances. Harlem was changing, whether its longtime residents were ready for it or not. The physical landscape reflected decades of social, economic, and cultural pressure. Buildings bore the marks of neglect and renovation in the same breath, walls scarred by past graffiti yet painted over with bright, fresh colors. Streets echoed with music that had shifted from the pulsating beats of underground culture to a mix of old favorites and new rhythms, blending nostalgia with emerging trends. Life moved forward, yet the traces of the past lingered, layered into the environment like sediment. Harlem's transformation was not just aesthetic, it was deeply social. Families who had weathered the crack era, the height of the drug trade, and systemic neglect were now navigating a landscape of rising rents and gentrification. Long-standing residents faced pressure to leave, either because of cost or cultural displacement. New faces appeared on the streets, students, artists, and professionals drawn by opportunity and the neighborhood's cultural reputation. For those who had lived through its darker chapters, the change was both hopeful and unsettling, signaling possibility and loss simultaneously. The social rhythm that had defined the streets during Azie's era of activity began to dissipate. The constant tension, the coded communication, the silent awareness that governed daily interaction, all of that had evolved. Neighborhood patterns shifted. Children played outside with different freedoms. Streets felt quieter in some ways, yet busier in others, as new forms of commerce and lifestyle replaced old systems. It was no longer a battlefield, but a crossroads of memory and modernity. Azie observed these changes with a reflective awareness. He had once navigated Harlem's energy with precision, reading the signals of behavior, evaluating threats, and assessing opportunity. Now, he saw that many of those signals had faded or altered in meaning. New rhythms dictated interaction. What had once been cautionary, shifts in body language, whispered conversations, rapid movements across corners, no longer carried the same weight. The streets themselves had grown less predictive, less dangerous, and more fluid in ways that demanded adaptation of perception rather than survival skill. Yet the past did not fully release its grip. Ghosts lingered in the neighborhoods, both literal and figurative. Empty apartments where tragedies had occurred, corners remembered by older residents, conversations recalled with a sigh, these echoes formed an undercurrent beneath Harlem's modernized surface. The contrast between what had been and what was becoming created a layered emotional geography, one that Azie could navigate with unique insight. He recognized what was visible and what remained hidden, the memory embedded in architecture, music, and spoken word. Culturally, Harlem retained its significance even as demographics shifted. Art, music, and literature continued to emerge, shaped by both the residue of past struggles and the influence of new communities. Festivals, performances, and exhibitions celebrated the neighborhood's history while simultaneously introducing fresh interpretations. The tension between memory and innovation created a dynamic environment that, while no longer dangerous in the same way, still carried depth and complexity. For those who had lived through the crack era and the hustle, the changes were bittersweet. Progress brought opportunity but also dislocation. Buildings that once offered cover or anonymity became visible, polished, or repurposed. Businesses that had provided income or employment for local residents faced competition from new, often more capitalized enterprises. Streets that had been navigable through knowledge of invisible rules were now layered with unfamiliar patterns. The game of survival had been replaced by the game of adaptation. Azie understood that the changes carried lessons as well. They highlighted the impermanence of any environment, no matter how familiar. Streets that had once felt eternal, imbued with energy and risk, could shift within a single decade. The structures of society, physical, social, and economic, were malleable, often indifferent to individual effort or history. Survival required more than intelligence or vigilance, it required awareness of change itself, and the ability to move within it. The transformation of Harlem also reshaped collective memory. Younger generations might walk the streets unaware of the battles fought quietly years before. The stories that had been lived were now told in fragments, filtered through media, legend, or anecdote. The rhythm of daily life no longer demanded that residents internalize the lessons of caution, observation, and restraint in the same way. Azie recognized that what remained visible to the casual observer was only a shadow of reality, a partial reflection of the neighborhood's lived history. For those who had survived the past, like Azie, this created a unique perspective. He could inhabit the present while remembering the past, understanding both the possibilities and dangers inherent in the transformation. The knowledge of what had been allowed him to navigate the present with a clarity others lacked, appreciating the progress while remaining cognizant of what had been lost. At the same time, the transformation prompted reflection on legacy. What did it mean for Harlem to change? What remained of the stories, the lessons, the culture that had once defined its streets so intensely? Azie considered these questions quietly, understanding that some aspects of a neighborhood's history can never be fully preserved. Memory, like physical space, is subject to erosion. Yet echoes remain, detectable to those who pay attention, subtle signals that connect past and present. The neighborhood's evolution also offered a form of closure. Spaces that had once been sources of danger became neutral, sometimes even nurturing. The streets that demanded constant alertness now offered the opportunity for casual observation, reflection, and even nostalgia. Azie could walk them freely, noting familiar landmarks while recognizing how much had changed. The transformation carried reassurance, survival was possible, and life could continue beyond the chaos. Still, the shadows lingered. The lessons of caution, vigilance, and discipline were not erased. They persisted in his memory, embedded in instinct, shaping behavior long after the neighborhood itself had shifted. Harlem had changed physically and socially, but the imprint of history remained, a subtle framework that informed present choices and perceptions. Ultimately, the transformation of Harlem underscored the impermanence of environments and the endurance of experience. Buildings could be renovated, streets repurposed, and populations shifted, yet the knowledge accumulated by those who had lived through its pressures retained value. For Azie Faison, walking through a neighborhood in flux was not just a stroll through space, it was a navigation through layered history, memory, and survival. He could witness the evolution while remaining grounded in the reality that had shaped him, understanding that while streets change, lessons endure. In this evolving Harlem, there was room for both reflection and movement forward. The ghosts of the past lingered, visible only to those who remembered, while the present offered new patterns, new possibilities, and a softer rhythm. For Azie, this duality became a space of quiet contemplation, a recognition that while the neighborhood had changed forever, the knowledge and wisdom gained from surviving it remained indelible, guiding him as surely as the streets themselves had once demanded. As the intensity of the streets faded from Azie Faison's life, a quieter set of lessons began to emerge, lessons written not in the chaos of confrontation or the thrill of fast money, but in the subtle details of observation, decision-making, and restraint. These were the lessons that could only be understood through lived experience, accumulated slowly over years of vigilance, calculation, and survival. They were quiet truths, often invisible to outsiders, yet profoundly shaping the course of a life that had once teetered on the edge of danger at every turn. One of the first lessons was the value of patience. In the hustle, it had been tempting to move quickly, to assert presence, to take what seemed immediately available. Many succumbed to this impulse, believing speed equated to advantage. Azie learned, through repeated observation and careful trial, that patience was more powerful than aggression. Waiting allowed situations to unfold, revealed intentions, and reduced unnecessary exposure. Patience was not passive, it was active calculation, a constant evaluation of timing, opportunity, and consequence. Closely tied to patience was the discipline of restraint. The streets rewarded bold action in appearance, but in reality, restraint often determined who survived and who fell. Azie realized that decisions made without tempering emotion, whether anger, pride, or fear, frequently led to catastrophe. Exercising restraint meant choosing silence over provocation, waiting instead of reacting, observing instead of asserting. This discipline carried a weight that could not be measured in dollars but was critical to survival. Observation itself became an art. In a world where threats could appear quietly and unexpectedly, seeing and interpreting subtleties was crucial. A gesture, a tone of voice, a hesitation, these often carried more meaning than words. Azie trained himself to read environments and people carefully, to notice patterns, and to anticipate outcomes based on small, consistent signals. He understood that information was a form of power, and the less he revealed, the more he retained. Another lesson was the importance of boundaries. In the hustle, relationships were often transactional, and crossing lines, territorial, personal, or moral, could be fatal. Azie learned to set clear limits, both with others and with himself. Boundaries allowed him to protect what was most valuable: information, trust, and freedom. They also created a mental space in which he could operate without constantly reacting to external pressures. Knowing where to draw the line was a skill refined over countless interactions and tests. Trust, too, became a nuanced concept. In the streets, trust was never absolute, it was provisional, conditional, and constantly tested. Azie observed that those who assumed loyalty without evidence often suffered the worst consequences. He learned to evaluate people by their actions over time, to weigh consistency more heavily than words, and to maintain compartmentalization to minimize exposure. Trust, once given, was never a guarantee of safety. Recognizing this early prevented unnecessary risk and fostered careful alliances that could endure pressure. Azie also internalized the lesson of awareness of limits. Many hustlers failed not because they lacked ambition, but because they underestimated the forces around them, the legal system, rival operators, and the unpredictability of human behavior. Recognizing the boundaries of one's influence, and acting within them strategically, became central to his approach. This awareness was neither defeatist nor timid, it was clarity, a realistic assessment of what could and could not be controlled. Equally important was the understanding that actions, once taken, could ripple far beyond intention. A small misstep, a careless conversation, a visible display of success, all could invite scrutiny, hostility, or betrayal. Azie learned to weigh consequences continuously, to calculate the potential chain reaction of every decision. The lesson was clear: vigilance extended not just to immediate threats but to potential downstream effects that could arise unexpectedly. The quiet resilience cultivated over years also taught him about emotional management. The streets were filled with triggers: provocation, envy, fear, excitement, and those who allowed emotions to govern decisions often suffered. Azie practiced deliberate detachment, not in coldness, but in measured control. Emotional composure became as essential as physical skill or knowledge of territory, shaping his responses and allowing him to act decisively when necessary. Another subtle lesson lay in understanding impermanence. Success, visibility, and even survival were not permanent states. Everything in the environment was fluid. Friends could disappear. Alliances could fracture. Circumstances could shift in an instant. Accepting impermanence allowed Azie to operate without attachment to outcomes, maintaining focus on adaptability and long-term strategy rather than short-term gratification. The cumulative effect of these lessons shaped his sense of self. Azie came to understand that survival required more than intelligence or courage, it required a synthesis of awareness, patience, restraint, and adaptability. Each lesson reinforced the others, creating a framework of thought that could guide behavior even when immediate circumstances were unpredictable. Even after leaving the hustle, these principles remained relevant. Life outside the streets carried its own challenges: financial decisions, interpersonal dynamics, and the ongoing work of rebuilding identity. The skills developed during years of vigilance translated into careful management of these new responsibilities. Patience, observation, and strategic restraint became tools for navigating ordinary life with the same effectiveness that had once protected him from extraordinary danger. Importantly, these lessons were often invisible to others. Survival, in its truest sense, does not require recognition. What mattered was the internalization of knowledge, the ability to act appropriately without needing external validation. Azie recognized that the most critical skills were those that could not be seen, measured, or dramatized. They existed quietly in judgment, timing, and discretion. These lessons also carried a moral dimension, subtle though not prescriptive. They were about understanding cause and effect, recognizing consequences, and navigating complex systems with integrity when possible. They highlighted the importance of restraint over impulse, awareness over assumption, and reflection over reaction. In a world that demanded constant calculation, such principles offered a form of ethical grounding amid chaos. Ultimately, the lessons written between the lines of Azie Faison's life were cumulative and enduring. They were learned through observation, practice, and adaptation. They were invisible to the casual observer but critical to the one navigating a world that could change in an instant. They emphasized patience, restraint, awareness, and strategic action above all else. And though they emerged from the crucible of the streets, they transcended it, shaping a life beyond the hustle and providing a framework for understanding both risk and opportunity in any environment. These quiet truths, painstakingly learned, offered clarity and continuity. They reinforced that survival, whether in the streets or in life beyond them, was not about dominance or aggression but about thoughtful, deliberate navigation. The value of these lessons was not measured in money, status, or recognition, but in the rarest of outcomes, the ability to endure, adapt, and ultimately live to see another day, unbroken and aware. By the time all the pieces of Azie Faison's story were in place, the long years on the streets, the close calls, the losses of friends, the pressures of survival, the central question remained quietly persistent: why did he survive when so many others did not? It was not a question that could be answered with a single event, a moment of luck, or a single trait. Survival was cumulative, built from countless decisions, observations, and adaptations, each one layering onto the next to create a fragile, but enduring, resilience. The first factor in his survival was awareness. Azie had learned to perceive the world in layers, to notice details others dismissed as inconsequential. A gesture, a pause in conversation, a subtle shift in tone, all carried information. Reading the environment carefully allowed him to anticipate risk before it became immediate. Awareness was not a talent born overnight, it was a skill honed through years of observation and reflection, sharpened by exposure to both success and failure. It allowed him to act preemptively, to sidestep danger that might have claimed others. Equally important was patience. Many hustlers approached the streets with urgency, believing speed equated to advantage. This approach often led to mistakes, conflicts, and exposure. Azie, however, understood the value of waiting, of letting situations unfold before committing to action. Patience was strategic, not passive. It allowed him to gather information, gauge intent, and adjust behavior in real time. By moving deliberately rather than reactively, he reduced the likelihood of errors that could be fatal. Restraint was another cornerstone. In a world that rewarded visibility and aggression, it might have seemed counterintuitive to exercise caution. Yet restraint, carefully applied, was a form of power. Azie learned to measure every response, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to act, and when to step away. Restraint kept him from becoming a target, from provoking attention, and from entangling himself in conflicts that offered little benefit. It was a quiet strategy, often invisible, but its effectiveness was unmistakable. Trust, or more accurately, cautious trust, played a role as well. He recognized that loyalty in the streets was fragile and conditional. By evaluating people based on consistent behavior rather than words alone, he could form alliances without compromising safety. Compartmentalizing interactions ensured that no single individual could jeopardize his position. This careful calibration of relationships was essential to navigating an environment where alliances shifted quickly and betrayal was never far away. The management of risk extended to timing. The streets operated in rhythms that dictated opportunity and danger. Knowing when to act and when to pause allowed Azie to maximize advantage while minimizing exposure. He observed patterns, of law enforcement activity, of rival operations, of community behavior, and adjusted his movements accordingly. Survival was rarely about confrontation, it was about positioning, anticipation, and subtle maneuvering within a constantly evolving landscape. Emotional control was critical. Fear, anger, and pride often drove decisions that led to downfall. Azie learned to regulate his responses, maintaining calm under pressure and evaluating choices without letting immediate emotion dictate outcomes. Composure under stress became a tool of survival, allowing him to navigate volatile situations with clarity and precision. Another essential element was humility. Recognizing the limits of one's influence, understanding that no amount of skill or caution could guarantee success, tempered decisions and actions. Many fell not because they were careless but because they overestimated control. Azie understood that luck, timing, and circumstance were as influential as strategy, and he accounted for these factors in every move. Humility allowed him to accept uncertainty without succumbing to recklessness. Experience itself became a teacher. Each encounter, each loss observed, each close call accumulated into a mental library of lessons. This repository of knowledge allowed him to make faster, better-informed decisions. He had witnessed firsthand how minor misjudgments could lead to catastrophic consequences. Learning from observation and personal experience created a framework for anticipating potential threats and avoiding the mistakes that claimed others. Adaptability was another decisive factor. The environment was never static. Rivalries evolved, law enforcement strategies changed, markets shifted. Survival required flexibility, both in tactics and in mindset. Azie adjusted not only his actions but also his expectations, understanding that rigid adherence to old patterns could be fatal. Flexibility allowed him to respond to new challenges without panic, maintaining equilibrium in circumstances that would have destabilized others. Luck, too, played a role, though it was not the kind celebrated in stories. It was the quiet, almost imperceptible alignment of events, being in the right place at the right time, avoiding arbitrary dangers, benefiting from circumstances beyond control. Yet luck alone was insufficient. What made it meaningful was the preparation, awareness, and discipline that allowed him to take advantage of it when it occurred. Survival was not passive, it was active management of chance as well as circumstance. Timing of disengagement was another critical factor. Many failed because they remained too long in an environment that demanded constant vigilance and adaptation. Knowing when to step away, and doing so with care, allowed Azie to avoid risks that escalated as the streets shifted. Exiting the game before it dictated his fate was a conscious strategy, one few were capable of executing successfully. Finally, reflection and foresight shaped his decisions. The ability to anticipate consequences, to weigh long-term outcomes against immediate gain, and to integrate past lessons into future actions created a mental advantage. Many hustlers live day to day, reacting to immediate pressures without planning for eventualities. Azie combined experience, awareness, and caution to forecast scenarios, allowing him to avoid pitfalls that ensnared others. The combination of these factors, awareness, patience, restraint, careful trust, timing, emotional control, humility, experience, adaptability, calculated luck, strategic disengagement, and foresight, formed a framework for survival. Each element reinforced the others, creating a cumulative effect that allowed him to navigate one of the most dangerous environments in modern American urban history. Ultimately, Azie Faison survived not because of a single moment of brilliance or luck, but because survival itself became a discipline, a lifestyle, and a mindset. It required constant vigilance, reflection, and adjustment. It demanded understanding the invisible rules, respecting limits, and acting with precision even under pressure. Most importantly, it demanded the courage to leave before the streets decided his fate for him. In looking back, it becomes clear that survival was not accidental. It was a product of intelligence applied consistently, of lessons learned through observation and experience, and of strategic restraint applied when the environment was most volatile. The streets were unforgiving, yet Azie navigated them with a combination of skill, patience, and insight that allowed him to endure where many others did not. His story is a testament not to daring alone, but to the quiet, disciplined, and deliberate choices that underpin true survival. It illustrates that life in the streets is not solely about action or aggression, but about understanding, patience, and awareness. These elements, quietly practiced over time, explain why Azie Faison remained alive to see a life beyond the game, a life shaped by the rare act of enduring through calculation, reflection, and the hard-earned wisdom of experience. As the years passed and the frenetic energy of Harlem's streets quieted, a new kind of reflection settled over Azie Faison. The world that had once demanded constant vigilance, calculation, and awareness was no longer the landscape that defined his everyday. Yet even in this quieter phase, the lessons of the streets remained embedded deeply within him, shaping how he thought, how he moved, and how he understood both danger and opportunity. The culmination of his story, the legacy that endured beyond immediate survival, was not measured in wealth, reputation, or notoriety, but in the rare and remarkable act of having navigated chaos without succumbing to it. It was the sound of a life unlost, a testament to discipline, patience, and awareness that had carried him through an era when few others emerged intact. Walking through Harlem years later, Azie's perspective had shifted. The streets that had once demanded constant attention now appeared familiar in ways they had not before. Buildings had been renovated or replaced, new businesses had emerged, and gentrification had brought a mixture of opportunity and displacement. Yet despite these transformations, the underlying rhythms of the neighborhood, the subtle ways people moved, the echoes of past transactions, the whispers of history, remained detectable to someone who had lived through its most volatile years. Each corner, stoop, and hallway carried memory, each streetlight a silent witness to moments of tension, triumph, and loss. For Azie, walking these streets was both nostalgic and instructive, a quiet reminder that while circumstances changed, the lessons of observation, restraint, and awareness were timeless. Even as the physical environment evolved, the psychological and emotional imprints of his past persisted. Years of survival under constant pressure had honed instincts that were now ingrained. Situational awareness, once a matter of life and death, became a lens through which he understood human behavior in broader contexts. He could sense tension, anticipate outcomes, and read subtle cues that others might overlook. These skills, developed under extraordinary circumstances, had lasting value beyond the streets. They informed interactions, decisions, and judgments in ways that were subtle but profound, offering a quiet advantage in navigating life beyond the hustle. Part of the enduring legacy was understanding the value of discretion. In a world where exposure could be fatal, Azie had learned that silence and subtlety often mattered more than action and visibility. This lesson extended far beyond street transactions. It shaped how he managed relationships, financial decisions, and even public perception. By keeping certain knowledge and decisions private, he preserved options and minimized risk. The principle was simple but powerful: the less people knew, the less power they had to influence outcomes that affected him. This lesson, learned in the crucible of Harlem's streets, continued to guide him long after the immediate dangers had passed. Financial prudence also became a cornerstone of his post-hustle life. While the streets had provided rapid, high-stakes income, it had also revealed how fragile and temporary wealth could be when visibility increased risk. Azie applied the same disciplined approach to money that had guided his hustling decisions: cautious, deliberate, and always strategic. He understood that true stability did not come from short-term gain or flashy displays, but from careful management and long-term planning. This approach allowed him to transition from a world of immediate pressure and risk to one of measured opportunity, securing a foundation that supported both personal growth and broader endeavors. Another element of his enduring survival was the capacity to reflect on the past without becoming trapped in it. The streets had been formative, but they were not all-defining. Azie could recall the moments of tension, observation, and decision-making with clarity, yet he had learned to separate memory from current reality. Reflection became a tool rather than a burden, offering insight without immobilizing fear or regret. By contextualizing past experiences, he could understand their lessons, apply their wisdom, and move forward without being constrained by the trauma or chaos of the past. This mental clarity was perhaps as significant as any external skill, shaping the way he approached life long after leaving the hustle behind. The human relationships that had been central to his survival also carried forward lessons of trust, loyalty, and discernment. In the streets, alliances were fragile and conditional, yet they were essential. Azie had learned to navigate complex networks of relationships, evaluating reliability, consistency, and behavior over appearances or promises. This understanding of human dynamics became a lifelong skill, allowing him to maintain meaningful connections while protecting himself from manipulation or betrayal. The principle was simple yet profound: the people around you matter, but only those who have proven themselves through consistent action earn enduring trust. This framework guided his interactions in both personal and professional contexts after leaving the streets. Azie's experience also underscored the value of humility. The streets had been unforgiving, and survival depended not on ego or bravado but on awareness, patience, and adaptation. Recognizing the limits of one's influence, understanding that control was always partial, and accepting uncertainty were critical to enduring where others fell. Humility allowed him to navigate danger without provoking it, to respect forces beyond his control, and to avoid unnecessary risk. These qualities, though developed under extreme circumstances, proved invaluable in life beyond Harlem's most volatile years, shaping decisions and interactions with foresight and prudence. The legacy of survival also extended to storytelling and memory. Unlike the myths propagated in media and film, Azie's lived experience was complex, nuanced, and deeply instructive. He understood that while myth could entertain, captivate, and inspire, it rarely captured the full spectrum of human experience: the calculated patience, the quiet observation, the emotional discipline that underpinned survival. Sharing these lessons, either directly or through reflection, became a way to honor the past and preserve wisdom that could benefit others. The difference between legend and lived reality was not merely factual, it was about understanding process over spectacle, preparation over improvisation, and restraint over impulsivity. Another dimension of his legacy was resilience. The streets tested every aspect of human capability: physical endurance, emotional regulation, strategic thinking, and social navigation. Enduring this environment required more than talent or courage, it demanded consistent application of learned skills under pressure. Azie emerged with a rare resilience, a capacity to endure stress, adapt to change, and remain functional and composed even when circumstances were hostile or unpredictable. This resilience, cultivated over years of lived experience, became a defining trait that continued to shape his life beyond the hustle. Equally significant was his insight into impermanence. Everything in the streets had been transient: alliances, income, territory, even personal safety. Recognizing the impermanent nature of circumstances allowed Azie to make decisions without attachment to outcomes that could not be controlled. This perspective informed both his survival strategy and his approach to life after leaving the streets, emphasizing flexibility, foresight, and acceptance of change as constants rather than anomalies. The discipline cultivated over years in Harlem also translated into a capacity for deliberate decision-making. Whereas peers might have acted on impulse or short-term gain, Azie had learned to evaluate consequences, anticipate reactions, and integrate both observation and experience into every choice. This strategic mindset was not limited to survival, it extended into broader life decisions, from financial planning to interpersonal engagement, ensuring that actions were measured and outcomes optimized. Perhaps most profoundly, the legacy of Azie Faison's life after the streets was the demonstration of agency. While the environment had been extraordinarily constrained, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation, he ultimately exercised the rare ability to disengage on his own terms. Walking away before the streets dictated his fate was an act of foresight, courage, and self-preservation. It represented the culmination of years of observation, discipline, and learned wisdom, a conscious choice to prioritize survival and autonomy over continued participation in risk-laden opportunity. This act alone distinguished his story from so many others who were claimed by circumstances beyond their control. Freedom became the final measure of success. Survival alone was insufficient, the ability to live independently, to make choices unbound by constant threat, was the rarest achievement. For Azie, the life he built after leaving the hustle allowed him to exercise judgment without fear, to navigate relationships with discretion, and to exist without the ever-present shadow of danger. The freedom he gained was both literal and psychological, a testament to the cumulative effect of all the lessons, discipline, and resilience he had cultivated over years of exposure to perilous circumstances. Looking back, it becomes clear that the story of Azie Faison is not simply one of survival, but of transformation. From a young man navigating the volatile streets of Harlem, he emerged into a life defined not by the chaos he endured but by the insight, patience, and wisdom that allowed him to endure it. His legacy is not the legend captured in films or retellings, but the enduring application of those lessons, the ability to observe, to restrain, to anticipate, to trust selectively, and ultimately, to walk away. In the quiet moments, walking through a Harlem that had changed around him, Azie carried these lessons forward. Each street, each corner, each familiar or altered landmark was a reminder of what had been survived, what had been learned, and what could now be applied in life beyond survival. The city itself, once a constant source of pressure and threat, now served as a canvas for reflection, a space in which memory, insight, and experience intersected to create understanding. The ultimate reflection of his life is that survival is not accidental. It is a disciplined practice, built from countless incremental decisions, guided by observation, tempered by restraint, and anchored in awareness of both self and environment. To navigate a world designed to punish missteps requires mastery over both circumstance and self. For Azie Faison, this mastery allowed him not only to survive but to transcend the circumstances that claimed so many others. His story is a testament to the quiet power of awareness and patience, the enduring value of restraint and discernment, and the extraordinary impact of making deliberate choices under pressure. It illustrates that true legacy is less about recognition, wealth, or spectacle, and more about the ability to endure, adapt, and live. Survival, in its most refined form, is the product of wisdom applied consistently, courage exercised with caution, and foresight that recognizes limits as well as opportunity. Ultimately, the life of Azie Faison after the streets serves as a model of reflection, adaptation, and quiet triumph. The streets demanded skill and discipline, but the life beyond them allowed the fruits of that experience to be fully realized. In stepping away, in applying lessons learned under extreme conditions to a new reality, he demonstrated that the most remarkable victory is not simply staying alive, it is surviving with the wisdom, composure, and freedom to shape one's own future. His story closes not with violence, spectacle, or dramatic confrontation, but with the soft, steady sound of a life unlost, a life preserved, and a life fully reclaimed.